Where is my paper in my file? Ah, here. Yeah. Just need a list of... The 125 plenary meeting of the General Assembly is called to order. The General Assembly will now continue its consideration of Agenda Item 34, Prevention of Armed Conflict, to execute the list of speakers from this morning's meeting. Before giving the floor to the speakers, an explanation of vote, may I remind the delegation that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I now give the floor to the distinguished permanent of Costa Rica.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Costa Rica voted in favor of the resolution on Syria because we believe that in present circumstances this is a necessary response to the extreme gravity of the situation that that country is suffering. Costa Rica believes that the inaction caused by the double veto in the Security Council, in addition to the enormous obstacles facing the joint UN and Arab League mediation, fully justify the General Assembly seeking other forms of bringing about a peaceful settlement to the humanitarian tragedy, the insecurity, and the regional instability caused by the conflict. Costa Rica highly values consensus in our organization. Nonetheless, the quest for consensus cannot paralyze the international community, nor must it weaken the message of the United Nations in the face of acts that are unacceptable, events unacceptable, such as those before us. The main source of the Syrian tragedy is the intransigence of its present government, its systematic use of violence against civilians, and its refusal to undertake in good faith the path of mediation proposed by the United Nations and the Arab League. Today we regret the resignation of the Joint Special Envoy Kofi Annan, but we understand that in present circumstances his capacity to act and influence had been exhausted. In addition to the intolerable human cost, this alarming combination of factors threatens to see the conflict involve the entire region and has led to a brutal civil war, fertile ground, as it always is, for fanaticism, terrorism, and chaos. For all of these reasons, we make a heartfelt appeal to the Syrian authorities to respect their commitments to international law, and in particular, international human rights and international humanitarian law. It is imperative that the necessary measures be taken to avoid further bloodshed and violations of human rights in accordance with their responsibility to protect their own population. This imperative must above all be carried out by the government, but it also involves the armed opposition and those who support them in these armed clashes and any other relevant actors in the conflict. Lastly, we want to emphasize that the decision on the way in which Syria organizes its government and its institutions belongs exclusively to the Syrian people through broad and inclusive political dialogue based on respect for diversity, tolerance, peace, and democracy. Thank you, Mr. President.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Vietnam.
Vietnam has been following closely the situation in Syria and share the deep concerns of the international community, including those of the countries in the region, over the lack of the progress towards political process and increasing instability and violence which have caused enormous losses to the Syrian people. We strongly call upon all parties concerned in Syria to seriously implement their agreement with the Joint Special Envoy of the United Nations and the League of Arab States, especially that about an immediate end to violence and prompt promotion of dialogue and national reconciliation to arrive at the Syrian-led political solution to the current situation. As a state party to international legal instrument on the prohibition and destruction of weapons of mass destruction, Vietnam demands the full compliance with the commitment under these instruments. Vietnam supports the position expressed by many countries upholding principles of international law and the United Nations Charter, including those on the respect of political independence, sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of state, and this principle should be the primary basis for action of state and organizations. Along that line, Vietnam does not support practices or implications that may create negative precedents that are not in keeping with this fundamental principle. We also reaffirm our strong support for all constructive efforts of the international community aimed at an early end of the crisis and the promotion of the Syrian-led political process in Syria, and calls for action consistent with that goal on the part of all states and organizations. Thank you, Mr. President.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Russian Federation.
Mr. President, the Russian delegation regrets the GA's adoption of the resolution, which only exacerbates the confrontational approaches to resolving the Syrian crisis, not helping in any way bringing the parties to a platform of dialogue and looking for peaceful ways to resolve the crisis in the interests of the entire Syrian people. Behind the facade of humanitarian rhetoric, the resolution hides blatant support to the armed opposition, which they're actively supporting, financing, giving them mercenaries, and they're arming, and this being done by well-known countries. It's not a coincidence that these countries were the most active sponsors of the resolution. In violating the UN Charter, the resolution goes into the jurisdiction, intrudes on the jurisdiction of the Council, which continues to actively consider Syria. In the text of the document, there are statements on the inability of the Council to effectively react to the Syrian crisis, and that's not the case. Enough to recall the unanimously adopted resolutions 2042, 2043, 2059. The Council is achieving a consensus when we talk about politically tried and balanced decisions, and they're being implemented when the members work hand in hand, and they don't act going outside the Council and the agreed frameworks and mechanisms for a Syrian settlement process. Today's resolution is harmful since it contradicts the efforts to help implement the Annan Plan and the Geneva Agreements of the Group of Actions. It undermines the chances for launching a Syrian process for a political settlement. We believe it unacceptable and attempts to turn back the mandate of the special envoy. We deeply regret Mr. Annan's decision to resign. We hope that this very experienced diplomat and politician will be replaced by a worthy successor, and that what's left until the 31st of August, he will work successfully to implement the Council's mandate. At this stage, the important thing is to prevent a slackening of international efforts to resolve the crisis in Syria. The Annan Plan, like the Geneva decisions, are still significant as a guideline for a peaceful settlement of Syria's problems. The members of the Action Group should very responsibly require strict implementation by all parties of the provisions of these documents and send a clear signal for an end to violence. In this regard, we favorably assess the statement of the Secretary General that the organization remains dedicated to achieving a diplomatic resolution of the crisis in Syria. In this situation, of particular significance is maintaining a UN presence in the country. In spite of all the difficulties faced by UNSMIS, it still is, in fact, the only independent source of objective information on the situation in the country, and an important instrument to help implementing the Annan Plan and the Geneva Communiqué. Thank you very much.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Israel.
It, malice may distort it, but there it is. The Assad regime could use a healthy dose of Churchill's wisdom today. No matter what Assad says, he can't alter the horrific truth about the brutality that he and his morally bankrupt regime have unleashed and are unleashing on the Syrian people. In the months since we gathered here to speak about Syria, the Assad regime has slaughtered thousands more innocent, indiscriminately murdering civilians, including women, children, using the firepower of its artillery, armor, and even, in some cases, its air force. The General Assembly is no stranger to distortions and absurdities, but over the course of several decades, the Syrian representative has managed to take the art of fabrication in this hall to new heights. If lying was an Olympic event, I have no doubt that the Syrian regime and its representatives could easily win a gold medal. Of course, it is nothing new for Assad and his representatives to blame all of the country's ills on Israel. But this time around, they have broadened their horizons to a whole range of other nations. Behind every rock and building in Syria, Assad sees not only Israelis, Brits and Frenchmen, but also Saudis, Qataris, Kuwaitis and Turks. He says that the slaughter in Syria is a Western and Arab conspiracy and has nothing to do with him personally. It is clear that the men, women and children of Syria are not the indiscriminate victims of a natural disaster. They are also not the accidental casualties of a war. The civilians of Syria are the deliberate targets of a brutal regime and its even allies who will commit any crime to keep Bashar al-Assad in power. On the ground, Iranians are assisting Assad's henchmen. They have been deployed on Syrian soil to help sustain the Syrian regime and take part in its killing spree against the Syrian people. The outside forces that have been instrumental in the slaughter in Syria speak in a Persian accent. Unfortunately, many in the international community do not yet acknowledge this fact, despite the overwhelming evidence that supports it. Yes, Mr. President, while the Security Council remains paralyzed in New York, Assad's Council of Terror continues to operate ruthlessly in Damascus. On Assad's advisory board sit Ahmadinejad and Nasrallah, who offer him guidance on how to butcher the Syrian people more effectively. Assad's partner in this trio of terror are not shy about discussing the role in the slaughter. Last week, Nasrallah gave a speech praising the Assad regime, calling it, and I quote, a real military partner. And just several days ago, Iran's vice president promised the Syrian foreign minister that Iran will continue to offer its, and I quote, experience and capabilities to Assad's killing machine. The experience and capabilities of Iran and Hezbollah in repression are on full display in Syria. They provide weapons, ammunition, training, intelligence, and logistical equipment to Assad. It is time for the international community to hold all those three members of the trio of terror accountable for their crimes. This trio poses the most immediate threat to international peace and security. The world can begin by calling Hezbollah exactly what it is, a group of global terrorists. For those in this hall who are still looking for more evidence that Hezbollah is a terrorist organization, I ask, what else, or what are you waiting for? The group has only been actively conducting terrorist acts for 3 decades. They murdered 241 American servicemen and 58 French servicemen in 1983, blowing up their barracks in Beirut. They bombed the Amir Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires in 1994, killing 85. And last month, the Hezbollah suicide bomber murdered 6 Israeli tourists on a bus in Bulgaria. What else does Hezbollah need to do for the world to understand that this is a terrorist organization? Today, Hezbollah's terrorist networks extends from the cities of West Africa to the communities of South America, to the villages of Lebanon and Syria. How many more innocents must fall victim to their terrorism before the world acts? Mr. President, for years Assad repeatedly denied he held chemical weapons. Surprise, surprise. Last week, we heard a new revelation from Syrian officials. Assad has chemical weapons and his government is prepared to use them. The world should wake up to this dangerous reality today, not tomorrow. We should not pretend that the regime that cuts the throats of children today will not be prepared to gas them tomorrow. Assad must know that he will be held accountable for using these weapons. He must understand that transferring chemical weapons to Hezbollah or other terrorist organizations is a red line that he cannot cross. The world's most dangerous ophthalmologist should not be allowed to claim that he is colorblind. When it comes to chemical weapons, this red line should be very, very clear. Mr. President, the lies of Assad are an affront to the thousands of Syrian civilians who have been murdered. Unlike the members of Assad's diplomatic service, these people have no opportunity to apply for political asylum. Instead, the women and children of Syria are shot trying to seek refuge in neighboring countries. Yet his lies cannot hide one simple truth. Bashar al-Assad has no moral authority to govern, he has no legitimacy to rule, and he never did. It is time for all in this organization to speak clearly, decisively, and truthfully about the reality on the ground in Syria. It doesn't make a difference where you come from, what politics you preach, and what faith you belong to. No decent human being can stay silent in the face of what is happening in Syria. And today, on behalf of the Israeli people and the Jewish people, I want to speak directly to the Syrian people. I know that our nations have a long history of conflict and are still separated by politics. Yet Israel's hand remains extended to the people of Syria. We continue to offer humanitarian aid, food, and medicine to you. And I want to use this platform today to again express Israel's hope for a brighter future for the Syrian people, along with the other people of the Middle East. A future of freedom, prosperity, and tolerance, a future of liberty and justice, a future of peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of United Republic of Tanzania.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm taking the floor to explain the position that the United Republic of Tanzania took in the vote on the draft resolution adopted this morning. At the outset, the United Republic of Tanzania expresses sympathy to Syria and the Syrian people for the deaths of innocent people, particularly women, children, and the elderly, who have always been victims of conflicts and wars around the globe. The United Republic of Tanzania fully recognizes the magnitude of the situation in the Syrian Arab Republic and appreciates the national, regional, and international efforts that were made at finding a peaceful solution to the crisis, including efforts by this august body through the Joint Special Envoy of the UN and the League of Arab States, His Excellency Kofi Annan. We have, however, abstained in the vote because of our strong belief that the crisis has been misdiagnosed according to the Charter of the United Nations. our vote should by no means be construed as an acceptance of the impunity in the massive violations, including human rights violations perpetrated by the whomsoever to innocent civilians in Syria. The United Republic of Tanzania adheres to the principles and the practice of non-discrimination, unity, and development. We are deeply concerned that the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, namely of sovereignty and non-interference in matters which are within the domestic jurisdiction of any state, have not been fully upheld in the Syrian crisis. Mr. President, it is regrettable that the draft resolution adopted on the Syrian Arab Republic has refrained from recognizing the external forces which have also contributed to the escalation and perpetuation of chaos in Syria. In our opinion, the omission has been and will remain a major obstacle in achieving a meaningful and peaceful solution to the crisis. In conclusion, Mr. President, we wish to reiterate that the United Republic of Tanzania will continue to abide by the fundamental principle of the African Union Constitutive Act of condemnation and the rejection of unconstitutional changes of governments. I thank you.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
Mr. President, we have noted that the draft resolution that the General Assembly just voted on, though undergone several amendments, has kept its substance unchanged. China is deeply worried by the increasingly grave situation in Syria and the continued escalation of the crisis. China opposes and condemns all forms of terrorism and violent acts against innocent civilians. We urge all parties in Syria to immediately and completely cease violence and create conditions for a political settlement to the crisis. Both the Syrian government and the oppositions have the obligation to restore peace and stability in Syria at an early date. What has happened proves that the imposition of pressure on only one party will not help resolve the Syrian issue. On the contrary, it will derail the political settlement of the crisis, cause further escalation of turmoil, and let the crisis spill over to other countries in the region, thus jeopardizing regional peace and stability. The only viable approach to the Syrian issue is to seek a just, peaceful, and appropriate solution through political means. A military approach will result in a larger conflict and more bloodshed. China regrets Mr. Kofi Annan's resignation from the post of the Joint Special Envoy. We have taken real actions to render active support and coordination to Mr. Annan's mediation efforts. We understand the difficulties and obstacles Mr. Annan's mediation has been facing with. We express appreciation for the positive and constructive role Mr. Annan has played in promoting a political settlement to the Syrian issue. Under the current circumstances, the international community should continue supporting the implementation of the Action Group communique adopted in Geneva, the relevant Security Council resolutions, and Mr. Annan's six-point plan. Syria's sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity should be respected. Syria's future and destiny should be determined by the Syrian people themselves. But the political settlement to the Syrian issue can only be led by the Syrian people and should be accepted by all relevant parties in Syria. To impose a solution from outside will not help defuse the Syrian crisis. China opposes any act of forcing a regime change. Sanctions will lead to nothing but a more complicated situation. The Security Council has been considering the situation in Syria, and its authority should be upheld. On the Syrian issue, China has no self-interest, but a persistent and responsible attitude. Our fundamental point of departure is to safeguard the purpose and principles of the UN Charter, as well as the basic norms governing international relations, including the principles of sovereign equality and non-interference in other internal affairs, to safeguard the interests of the Syrian people and the Arab states, and to safeguard the interests of all countries, small and medium-sized in particular. This is China's consistent stance in all international affairs. It is not targeted at a particular issue or time. China understands the concern of Arab countries and the League of Arab States about an early settlement to the Syrian issue. We set store by the important role they have played in seeking a political settlement to this issue and appreciate their efforts in that regard. China stands ready to make concerted efforts with the international community, the Arab states included, to uphold the general direction of seeking a political settlement to this issue and encourage political dialogue to resolve differences and ease tension so as to safeguard the fundamental interests of the people in Syria and other countries in the region and preserve peace and stability in the Middle East. China's vote on the draft resolution was cast according to the above-mentioned stance. I thank you, Mr. President.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, Mr. President. My country, Syria, while regrets the adoption of the blatantly biased and unbalanced draft resolution for the reasons that I have outlined in my statement in the morning plenary meeting, Syria thanks all countries that did not vote in favor of that resolution, which is a responsible position that upholds the principles of the United Nations and the provisions of the Charter, a position that rejects the policies of intervention and promoting chaos in international relations, especially as this chaos is associated with constructive chaos. Also, Syria, government and people expect the United Nations organization as well as member states to be aiding Syria in confronting a culture of extremism and terrorism, whether its origin is in Israel or it is anchored in an ideology of fundamental or Qaeda principles. Syria expects the promotion of inclusive national dialogue as a way for a peaceful resolution of the crisis under the six-point plan. It expects bringing pressure to bear on parties that embrace violence and terrorism to cease from that. The government of Syria, for its part, has committed to cease violence and has withdrawn heavy weapons from cities since the 12th of April last to demonstrate its commitment to the first item in the Kofi Annan plan. But the armed groups did not fulfill their commitments in those terms. Quite the opposite. Those groups exploited this government commitment in order to fill the security vacuum emanating from the cessation of violence by the government forces. They tried to control population neighborhoods by force of arms and using civilians as human shields. Those groups intensified their assaults against civilians, military personnel, and state institutions, supported in those actions by some parties, both governments and groups in our region and beyond. Ladies and gentlemen, the states that call for successive meetings of the Security Council, the General Assembly, and Human Rights Council actually aim to provide political coverage for the actions of the armed terrorist groups operating in Syria and to cover their crimes against the Syrian population in terms of aggressions against civilians, public property, private property, and killing of qualified personnel and abduction of citizens in return for paying a ransom, and the bombing of electric power stations and oil and gas transportation lines, and stealing agricultural crops, and attacking police stations and burning hospitals and clinics. Some parties are relentlessly seeking, ladies and gentlemen, to harm the dignity of some segments of the Syrian population who are encouraged to leave the country and then convert them to imprisoned refugees in camps, the least of which could be described as detention camps, where their anguish and dilemma is exploited in cheap bidding markets and political blackmail under false slogans provided to them. And this is, by the way, promises that have not been delivered as yet, let alone the fact that some of these camps have been converted into military centers where terrorists are being assembled in order to prepare them for sending them later to Syria in order to commit their horrendous crimes, as happened in the past and as what is going now, this very moment, in the city of Aleppo. The establishment of a national reconciliation ministry within the cabinet of Syria is a testimony to the genuine desire of the Syrian government to ensure the success of the inclusive national dialogue among all segments of the Syrian population in order to achieve a peaceful resolution of the current crisis. And this is precisely what set forth in the six-point plan. What is strange, ladies and gentlemen, that the European Union has imposed on the Minister of National Reconciliation himself sanctions only a few days after he assumed his portfolio, despite the fact that this minister who is responsible for this important ministry is from the Syrian opposition groups. The foreign intervention in Syrian affairs has changed the demands, legitimate demands, of the Syrian population, to put it in third rank or fourth in terms of priorities. And this foreign intervention has made these reforms, turned them into armed rebellion against the Syrian state that is operated from outside Syria, and unfortunately from some Arab countries. My colleague, the Saudi ambassador, has put forward a totally erroneous picture of what is happening in my country. And I'm not going to address all those mistakes, but I shall be exclusive in addressing the remarks that he made regarding our brother Palestinian refugees in Al Yarmouk refugee camp in Damascus. And I say first, this refugee camp hosts our brethren Palestinian refugees who have been expelled by the Israeli occupation authorities from their homeland between 1948 and 1967. But this refugee camp has become a camp that hosts also Syrian citizens who are double the number of Palestinian refugees living there. And therefore, this refugee camp does not host exclusively our brethren Palestinian refugees. 2, the representatives of Palestinian organizations in that refugee camp issued an official statement in which they indicated that those who fired at the camp are members of armed terrorist gangs who sought to plunge the Palestinian refugees living in Syria into the armed rebellion against the Syrian state. And therefore, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who are sponsoring those terrorist armed groups are conspiring against the safety, well-being, and stability of our Palestinian refugees brothers living in Syria. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, we said that this Saudi-Qatari draft resolution actually serves the Israeli interests that target Palestinian refugees both inside Palestine and outside it. Also, what would my Saudi colleague would say about the brutal armed practices of the Saudi army against the peaceful reform demands of Saudi citizens in both Qatif and Awamiya regions in Saudi Arabia? Could he explain to this distinguished assembly what are the Saudi armed forces doing in Bahrain? My colleague, the representative, said that he was submitting the draft resolution on behalf of the Arab group. This is not true. As you are aware, 2 Arab states did not support this draft resolution. And therefore, the claim that this draft resolution was submitted on behalf of the Arab group is a false claim. It is totally unfounded. It is indeed regrettable, ladies and gentlemen. It is really strange that my colleague, the Saudi representative, would put words in the mouth of Mr. Kofi Annan and to give strange interpretations to the demand of Mr. Annan in order not to extend his mission. In this regard, we express our regret towards the fact that Mr. Annan submitted his resignation. And let me reiterate that Syria has all along declared and proved its full commitment to implement the 6-point plan of the United Nations envoy and cooperated with the group of observers in order to achieve the desired goals of that plan. Mr. President, distinguished delegates, Israeli state terrorism was the source of spreading the culture of terrorism across the globe. It is perhaps appropriate, as was said by the Israeli delegate, that some Olympic Games should be organized, but exclusively for terrorism. And then Israel would be awarded the top prize, the first position. And in honor of that win, the anthem of shedding the blood of innocent civilians in celebration of that terrorism. The scandals of Israel in violating the provisions of Charter are difficult to count here. Inside Palestine and outside are well documented in the archives of the United Nations. Assassinating of peace activists, members of those countries have been of countries that sponsored this draft resolution, hijacking civilian planes and killing scores of Palestinian, Lebanese, and Syrian citizens in the Golan. The ultimate of hypocrisy and misinformation were the remarks of the Israeli delegate when he talked about fear of chemical weapons. He ignored the fact that Israel itself did not accede to the Convention on Chemical Weapons and refuses to implement resolution on the Middle East of 1995 regarding the review of the NPT, that resolution which called for establishing a weapon zone free of all weapons of mass destruction. And as a result, Israel is not a member of the NPT. And therefore, Israel and its delegate should rather remain silent, because their mere remarks about that is a shame for them. Israel has in its arsenal 300 nuclear weapons. Germany has added, thankfully, 6 submarines that are capable and empower Israel to fire those nuclear missiles. And by the way, Germany is a sponsor of this draft resolution. This makes me conclude that there is a Western, Israeli, and some Arab alliance here. Let the Israeli delegate maintain his offered assistance, which is misleading, to himself. The people of Syria is not in need of these poisons. The people of Syria waits impatiently the liberation of Syrian Golan from the vices of the Israeli occupation, which is supported by many member states that sponsored the draft resolution. Let me remind the Israeli delegate that the international law is on our side and not on the side of the Israeli policies, irrespective of the thrust and purposes of those Israeli policies. These are policies of aggression, policies of occupation that occupied some 50% of the agenda of this General Assembly since the creation of the World Organization. The irresponsible Israeli policies that I referred to would eventually lead to further escalation, violence, terrorism in our region as well as in the whole world. It is not possible for what is called international community to fight terrorism in one area while encourages the Israeli state-sponsored terrorism in other areas. For all these reasons, ladies and gentlemen, let me say that the draft resolution, which was sponsored by the West, Saudi Arabia and Qatar against my country, serves only the interests of Israel and its aggression. I thank you, sir.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Uruguay.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Uruguay delegation voted in favor of the draft resolution in document A66 L57 because it is our understanding that this decision of the General Assembly of the UN establishes elements of fundamental importance to contribute to the cessation of violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms of the Syrian population, and for the adoption of the necessary measures to facilitate a peaceful solution in keeping with international law. This resolution, Mr. President, clearly expresses the feeling of the majority of the international community in the face of the extremely grave occurrences in Syria. The Uruguayan government also reiterates its support for the efforts of the Secretary General of the United Nations and of his high representatives. And of course, we regret the resignation of Special Envoy Kofi Annan. We support the work of the international organizations in accordance with Chapter 8 of the United Nations Charter to achieve the above-mentioned objectives. In this regard, I would like to underscore that we consider it of primary importance for the attainment of a peaceful solution that the rights of the civilian population be preserved as a main objective, and that all actions to be undertaken by the different parties involved must be in the framework of the strictest and most absolute respect for the principles and standards of international law. The search for a peaceful solution by the Syrian people in a sovereign way must be upheld.
Distinguished representative of Argentina.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the Argentine delegation wants to express its grave concern at the situation being experienced by the Syrian Arab Republic, and we regret that once again the structure of the Security Council, with permanent members with the right to veto, has resulted in inaction by the international community in a crisis in which we all agree on the need to stop the violence and to have the human rights of the affected population respected. The General Assembly has a responsibility given to it by the Charter. It is also the responsibility of member states by virtue of our commitment to respect and enforce the purposes and principles on which we have built this organization. For the majority of the countries in the world, the United Nations is a necessary and unique institution in defense of the rules and principles that must govern the conduct of the members of the international community. Therefore, any stand taken by the General Assembly must have as its objective to promote a peaceful and lasting solution to the situation in Syria, respecting the internal affairs of that country and protecting the human rights of its inhabitants. For these reasons, Mr. President, the delegation of Argentina voted in favor of the draft resolution. In order, first of all, to promote action by the General Assembly aimed at putting an end to the violence in Syria as promptly as possible, and secondly, to promote and defend full respect for human rights in Syria. Thirdly, to support the appeals from the international community that all parties respect the recommendations made by different forums and bodies in this organization in order to meet these objectives, including the implementation of the six-point plan by the joint special envoy of the United Nations and the Arab League. My delegation, Mr. President, also wants to state that our affirmative vote is on the understanding that the appeal that an end be put to the violence is addressed to all parties and not just to the Syrian government. It is my country's hope that all states will refrain from taking actions that spur the violence in Syria. Argentina recognizes and values the efforts of the Arab League to find a political solution to the Syrian crisis, but we do not globally endorse all its decisions, resolutions, and measures. Lastly, Mr. President, my delegation believes that nothing in this resolution opens the door to the use of armed force by any members of the international community, and in particular regarding an interpretation of references to the protection of the civilian population in Syria contained in preambular paragraph 14 and the consideration of appropriate measures where the Security Council is referred to in paragraph 9. Thank you.
Syria.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Nigeria deeply regrets that the situation in Syria continues to deteriorate rapidly, and the concerned parties, as well as the international community, have so far failed to bring about an end to the conflict. We also received with profound concern the announcement of the resignation of the joint UN Arab League envoy, His Excellency Kofi Annan, as mediator in the Syrian conflict. This brings into sharp focus the protracted nature of the conflict and the diverse challenges therein. Mr. Annan's resignation is a major setback for the UN initiative in Syria. Indeed, it portends the worsening of an already dire situation in that country. The lack of support for his six-point plan is indicative of the ineffectiveness of the UN in particular and the international community in general to deal decisively and transparently with the situation in Syria. Clearly, therefore, the UN and the larger international community have the responsibility and indeed the moral obligation to act appropriately to stem the deterioration of the situation in the country and help the Syrian people to realize their cherished desire for peace. In this connection, we believe that Resolution A/66/L57, which was adopted earlier today, imperfect as it is, provides the much-needed and presently lacking impetus for action by the General Assembly towards a resolution of the crisis. The imperfection of the resolution which we alluded to are indeed matters of concern. We have misgivings about some issues, among which is the lack of balance in the text. It is heavily tilted against one party to the conflict and mentions only the Syrian authorities by name. It also holds only one side accountable for atrocities and human rights violations committed in the conflict. Additionally, our support for this resolution does not imply a blanket endorsement of the decision of the Arab League of 22nd July 2012 reached at Doha, which inter alia implicitly calls for regime change and the imposition of sanctions on the Syrian government, as these are matters beyond the remit of the General Assembly, but squarely within the purview of the Security Council. We also do not believe that the call to welcome the Syrian Opposition Conference, held under the auspices of the Arab League and encouraging greater cohesion in the opposition, is the responsibility of the General Assembly. Indeed, such will undermine the authority and impartiality of this august assembly. Mr. President, in spite of all these shortcomings, Nigeria voted in favor of the resolution on grounds of certain fundamental principles and belief, which underpin our foreign policy and national outlook. Nigeria has consistently and openly advocated respect for democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and accountability in all states. We have stood for the protection of civilians in conflict situations. We have long-standing commitment to conflict prevention and peaceful resolution of disputes, as demonstrated by our peacekeeping antecedents. Nigeria also believes in the importance of regional initiatives in resolving disputes. As such, it supported the Arab League initiative on Syria, especially aimed at bringing to an end the grave humanitarian crisis in the country. This is consistent with our stance on similar situations in our own part of the world. In voting for the resolution, Nigeria was moved by the concern for the escalating violence, degenerating human rights and humanitarian situation, and the deplorable loss of life in Syria. Beyond the adoption of this resolution in the General Assembly today, Nigeria calls on the Security Council to live up to its charter obligations towards the maintenance of international peace and security, and address constructively, transparently, and more importantly, in an even-handed manner, the grave and rapidly deteriorating situation in Syria. The bloodshed must be stopped now. The possible disintegration of that country must be avoided. We expect the Security Council to take action quickly, and the General Assembly should facilitate the move towards dialogue, reconciliation, and peaceful resolution of the present crisis in Syria. At the end of it all, Mr. President, only the Syrian people, in the exercise of their sovereign right, could decide their future and chart a course for the continued well-being of their country. Nigeria, therefore, supports a peaceful, Syrian-led resolution of the conflict without undue external interference. Mr. President, this resolution provides an opportunity to stem the tide of conflict and human suffering in Syria. We believe that its full implementation by all parties to the conflict has great potential for bringing peace and an end to the conflict in Syria. I thank you, sir.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Serbia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Serbia voted in favor of the text of the resolution with the understanding that all international efforts should aim solely for an urgent end of violence. Serbia fully supports the principle of peaceful settlement of all disputes and underscores the need for a comprehensive political dialogue between all sides involved in the conflict, with the aim to achieve a sustainable political solution that would contribute to the stability of the region. Thank you, Mr. President.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Dominican Republic.
Okay. Gracias.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation voted in favor of this resolution on the situation in Syria, and we wish to state why. This is a resolution with a controversial text that was clear in meetings over the last few days when the resolution was introduced, and this very day before it was put to a vote in the General Assembly. It could not be otherwise, Mr. President, because this is a resolution that deals with the situation of armed conflict, virtually a civil war, which is now prevailing in the Syrian Arab Republic. And any conflict is a combat, a disagreement, a controversy. This is a resolution which deplores that the Security Council has not been able to ensure that its decisions be fulfilled by the Syrian authorities. But this will not produce an immediate change in the situation. It is not a perfect resolution, nor could it be, nor does it need to be, Mr. President. For purposes of this General Assembly, this has been the resolution that is possible, the resolution that could accumulate the critical mass of votes needed to be adopted. It's precisely for that reason that this has galvanized us toward a decision that the Dominican Republic has voted in favor of the resolution. The resolution is a difference between keeping one's arms crossed or trying to reconcile political interests and trying to do something to show that this organization is not silent and that it's not indifferent to the suffering and the aspirations of the Syrian people. And this is why the delegation of the Dominican Republic decided to support this resolution. We decided to support it because the situation on the ground has worsened. It's fraught with alarming events, massively tragic events, which can lead to something much more widespread, much more globalized, and much more destructive. And for this reason, we hope that differences of view among the permanent members of the Security Council can soon be overcome, so that the six-point plan of the Joint Special Envoy of the United Nations and the League of Arab States can be implemented in the situation in Syria. If that course of action is delayed any further, Mr. President, we'll confront the inevitable reality that violence is what will impose its own brutal, unstoppable solution. And it will do that in spite of all efforts and all good intentions on the part of this organization. Thank you, Mr. President.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. Since the last meeting of the General Assembly on this agenda item, the situation in Syria has steadily deteriorated. Neither side has implemented its obligations under the six-point plan of the Joint Special Envoy, Kofi Annan, which was endorsed by the Security Council Resolutions 2042 and 2043. The conflict has got increasingly more militarized, and a number of terrorist acts have been committed against state institutions and public infrastructure. There have been gross violations of human rights by all sides. The humanitarian situation has also become dire, and more than 2 million Syrians are said to be in need of humanitarian assistance. Unfortunately, the Syrian parties, instead of seriously commencing a Syrian-led political process, have pursued a military approach to realize their objectives. We strongly condemn all violence and violations of human rights, irrespective of who their perpetrators are. We also condemn, in the strongest terms possible, the terrorist acts that have been and continue to be committed in Syria. We call upon all parties to disassociate themselves from terrorist groups and ensure that no space is provided for these groups. Mr. President, under the prevailing circumstances in Syria, there is an urgent need for the international community to close ranks and send a united message to the Syrian parties to walk back from their military approach and resolve the crisis through an inclusive Syrian-led political process. There is no other way to bring about a sustained cessation of violence in all its forms by all parties. This is also the only way to end human rights violations and create an atmosphere for safe and unhindered delivery of urgently needed humanitarian assistance. Mr. President, we have consistently called for international efforts to assist the Syrian parties to resolve the crisis and bring about peace through dialogue and political processes. Accordingly, we have strongly supported the efforts of the Joint Special Envoy, Kofi Annan. Even though Mr. Annan has resigned, it is important to note that his efforts have put in place a set of valuable documents which, if implemented, can facilitate a political resolution of the Syrian crisis without any further bloodshed. In order to assist the Syrian parties change their course and address the crisis through political dialogue, it is important that all parties, inside and outside Syria, fully abide by their obligations under Resolutions 2042 and 2043. The parties must be prevailed upon to implement the relevant resolutions of the Council and the final communiqué issued at Geneva on 30th June, which have been accepted by the government of Syria. Mr. President, India firmly believes that it is critical for the United Nations to remain strongly involved with the Syrian parties and other actors in the search for a way forward. Unilateral action of any kind will not resolve the crisis. It will only exacerbate the problem and cause greater instability and violence. We also believe that the process and the leadership of Syria is for Syrians to decide through a democratic process. The task of the international community, anchored in the United Nations, is to assist the Syrian parties in this process. Mr. President, The resolution that the General Assembly has adopted today makes specific reference to the decision of the League of Arab League of 22 July 2012. Though we do not hold any brief for any particular Syrian leader, we cannot welcome the League of Arab States resolution of 22 July, which openly called for President Assad to step down from power and for other UN members to sever diplomatic relations and contacts with Syria. It is unfortunate that this element of the present resolution was not removed, and hence we have abstained from the resolution today. I thank you.
Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Guyana abstained on draft resolution A/66/L57, situation in the Syrian Arab Republic. In explanation of vote, I have the honor to make the following statement. A tragedy is unfolding in Syria that should have been avoided. Innocent civilians are paying an increasingly heavy price for a spiraling conflict involving multiple actors and interests. Guyana is gravely concerned at the escalation of violence and condemns unequivocally all violations of human rights by whomsoever committed. We deplore the tragic loss of life and the increasing fatalities recorded, especially among the civilian population. We are equally concerned about the humanitarian impact on the affected population. All perpetrators should be held to account. Primary responsibility falls to the Syrian authorities to take steps for the cessation of violence and to ensure an end to human rights violations and attacks against civilians, to protect its population, and to fully comply with its obligations under applicable international law. But in the current context of an increasing militarization of the situation, the international community cannot turn a blind eye to the actions of armed opposition groups or to terrorist elements. The evident complexity of the situation demands a united and comprehensive response by the international community addressing all sides, government and opposition, including armed opponents. Guyana is concerned that the present draft resolution falls short in this regard and raises the prospect of undue partiality to an amorphous and unknown opposition, and of encroaching on the sovereign rights and prerogatives of the Syrian people to determine their leadership. Mr. President, in the interest of the Syrian people, the United Nations must remain unceasing in its efforts to end the bloodshed on all sides and assist in the search for a viable political solution. In this context, the six-point plan of the joint UN and Arab League Special Envoy remains valid and should be advanced in all its aspects. We support the continued efforts of the Secretary General towards this end. Given the gravity of the situation, Guyana believes that it is imperative that the Security Council urgently fulfill its responsibility under the Charter to meet this threat to international peace and security and avert a further deterioration of conditions on the ground. The international community must urgently unite in responding to the plight of the Syrian people. I thank you.
We have heard the last speaker in explanation of vote, and now in statement after adoption, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of European Union.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union. The acceding countries Croatia, the candidate countries, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, Montenegro, Iceland, and Serbia, the country of the stabilization and association process and potential candidate Albania, the EFTA countries Liechtenstein and Norway, members of the European Economic Area, as well as the Republic of Moldova and Georgia, align themselves with this statement. We strongly supported the resolution regarding the situation in Syria introduced by the Arab Group and welcome the adoption by the General Assembly earlier today. The European Union stands by the Syrian people at this critical juncture in their peaceful and courageous struggle for freedom, dignity, democracy and human rights. It strongly condemns the ever-increasing use of force by the regime, including use of heavy artillery and shelling from tanks, aircrafts and combat helicopters against populated areas in blatant violation of its obligation under the Annan Plan and the UNSC Resolution 2042 and 2043. We urge the Syrian regime to end immediately the killing of civilians, seize the use of heavy weapons, withdraw these weapons and the Syrian army from besieged towns and cities in order to allow for a peaceful transition. International humanitarian law must be respected by all. We are deeply concerned about the recent intensification of violence, including in Damascus and Aleppo. The only way out of this violence leads via a political transition that would meet the democratic and participatory aspirations of the Syrian people and bring back stability in Syria. The European Union remains committed to the sovereignty, independence, national unity and territorial integrity of Syria. The European Union recalls its full support to the joint UN League of Arab States Special Envoy's mission and his six-point plan that must be implemented immediately and visibly. The EU commends the efforts of Mr. Kofi Annan, who announced his resignation at the UN-LAS Joint Special Envoy to Syria. The European Union has provided its full backing to the work of Mr. Annan throughout his mandate and his efforts to finding a peaceful solution to the crisis. We continue to support the efforts of the UN and the LAS. This resignation stresses the urgency of a full, verifiable and immediate implementation of the six-point plan to allow for a political transition. The European Union underlines that those whose presence would undermine the transition should be excluded and that President Assad in this regard has no place in the future of Syria. The EU calls for united action by all members of the UNSC to exert a more robust and effective pressure and ensure that there will be serious consequences for continued non-compliance with its previous decisions. The EU remains deeply concerned about the human rights situation and breaches of international humanitarian law in Syria. The systematic and widespread human rights violations committed by the regime demonstrate its outright contempt for human rights. We are also concerned about recent reports of alleged use of cluster munitions against civilians. We reaffirm our support to the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Syria and its investigations into alleged violations of international human rights law, with a view to hold to account those responsible for such violations, including for those that may amount to crimes against humanity. The EU recalls that all those responsible for widespread, systematic and gross human rights violations must be held accountable. Recalling that the main responsibility for the current crisis lies with the Syrian authorities, the EU warns against further militarization of the conflict and sectarian violence, which can only bring further suffering to Syria and risks having a tragic impact on the region. In this regard, the EU expresses concern about the protection of civilians, in particular vulnerable groups and religious communities. We are also concerned about the influx of weapons into Syria. Therefore, we call on all states to refrain from delivering arms to the country. The EU is seriously concerned about the potential use of chemical weapons in Syria. We call upon Syria to strictly abide by its obligations under the 1925 Geneva Protocol. The EU attaches the greatest importance to the safe and secure storage of these weapons of mass destruction. It expresses its hope that the future Syria will accede to the Chemical Weapons Convention, thus joining the aspirations of the international community to ban and universally and completely eradicate this category of weapons of mass destruction. The EU continues to urge all opposition groups to put aside their differences and to agree on a set of shared principles and start working towards an inclusive, orderly and peaceful transition in Syria. In this regard, we welcome the efforts made by the opposition groups in recent meetings to elaborate on a common vision for the political transition of Syria in the post-Assad era. All Syrians must have a place in the new Syria and enjoy equal rights, regardless of their origin, affiliations, religion, beliefs or gender. The EU remains deeply concerned about the spillover effects of the Syrian crisis in neighboring countries in terms of security and stability. It calls on the Syrian regime to respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of neighboring countries. We call on all parties to allow full, safe and unhindered access for humanitarian workers, to respect international humanitarian law, including the respect and protection of civilians, and, as a first step, to facilitate the implementation of humanitarian pauses to allow for the safe delivery of humanitarian aid. The EU stands ready to offer additional support, including financial, to help neighboring countries, including Lebanon and Jordan, to host the increasing number of Syrian refugees fleeing violence in Syria. The European Union will increase its humanitarian assistance to the Syrians, including internally displaced persons and refugees, and calls upon all countries to do likewise in a transparent and coordinated manner, with particular attention paid to UN-coordinated humanitarian response plans. The European Union approved on 23 July the designation of new persons and entities to be subject to restrictive measures. In particular, members of the army and the intelligence and security services directly involved in the repression of the civilian population. We also agreed on measures to strengthen the enforcement of the EU's arms embargo. The EU will continue its policy of imposing additional measures targeting the regime, not the civilian population, as long as repression continues. We will also continue to urge the international community to join our efforts in taking steps to apply and enforce restrictive measures on the Syrian regime and its supporters. The European Union recalls that as soon as a genuine democratic transition begins, it is ready to develop a new and ambitious partnership with Syria across all areas of mutual interest, including by mobilizing assistance, strengthening trade and economic relations, and supporting transitional justice and the political transition. Thank you, Mr. President.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of New Zealand.
Thank you, Mr. President. In early June, the Secretary-General told this General Assembly that Syria was at a critical moment and called on us to act with unity and with a collective will. Yet, here we are, 2 months later. The violence escalates, the death toll continues to rise, and many parts of Syria lie in ruins. The Syrian government has failed to honour its agreed commitments under the 6-point plan, leaving its sponsor, Kofi Annan, frustrated and ultimately resigned, citing, among other things, the lack of clear unity in the Security Council. And we join China, Costa Rica and those others who have expressed regret at his resignation. Mr. President, as the Secretary-General has more recently pointed out, Syrian government officials have repeatedly said they would honour their commitments under that plan, but we are still waiting for them to act. Indeed, New Zealand waits for all sides to act. But unquestionably, it's the Syrian government that grows seemingly more scornful of international efforts to resolve this crisis, with its continued use of heavy weapons and now the aerial bombardment of Aleppo. Those government forces have an overwhelming advantage of military hardware and firepower, which, while non-government forces have now acquired some such weaponry by supply, capture or defection, still explains any perceived asymmetry in this resolution. The Security Council has been blocked from acting with firm resolve, and member states who seek a rapid and peaceful end to this crisis are left wondering, what else can be done? I hope, Mr. President, we won't have to convene again in another 2 months only to be told that for ordinary Syrians, the situation has deteriorated even further while the world stands by unable to act. To use the Secretary-General's words from this morning, we must not fail that test. Against that awful background, we applaud regional efforts to resolve the crisis, notably this initiative by some Arab states. Mr. President, this crisis is sorely testing our collective ability to work for peace. In the absence of action under Chapter 7 of the Charter, and as you, Mr. President, have rightly drawn attention to the Security Council being deadlocked, this General Assembly has, as you said, a role to play. And this resolution is the next best option, building as it does on the loud and now constant demands of the international community for an end to the violence in Syria. Mr. President, we are appalled at the Syrian government's threatened use of chemical weapons. It is essential that the international community presents a strong and united resolve against the use of such weapons. Indeed, we remind all parties, government and opposition, of all of their obligations under international humanitarian law for the protection of civilians in non-international armed conflict. We do not turn a blind eye to humanitarian crimes by whomsoever they are committed. We say quite clearly, those responsible for crimes against humanity, whichever side they may be, cannot be part of Syria's future. New Zealand remains committed to the fight against impunity for such violations, and we call on all sides to cooperate with the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Syria. Mr. President, as the violence escalates, so too does the humanitarian crisis. As we here seek a political solution, we must always be mindful of the suffering of internally displaced persons and refugees, and of the enormous burden their plight imposes on surrounding countries to whom we, the United Nations, owe a debt of gratitude. This is, Mr. President, a deeply unsettling time for the whole of the Middle East. We all understand the historic importance, the cultural depth of Syria. But all of us, not least those whose veto has deadlocked the Security Council, should pay heed to the Secretary-General's warning that a sectarian civil war in Syria would gravely imperil Syria's neighbours. And all that, Mr. President, all that because one man and the clique that surrounds him have lost all touch with reality, have lost all legitimacy, and don't know when enough is enough.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Canada.
Mr. President, Canada deplores the ongoing situation in Syria, which has claimed too many lives and threatens to inflame sectarian strife. Deteriorating conditions have increased tensions in Lebanon, and a massive outflow of refugees to Jordan, Turkey, Iraq, and Lebanon has created a humanitarian challenge for these countries and the international community. Canada is disappointed by the Security Council's inability to act together to bring an end to the bloodshed in Syria. The international community cannot stand by in the face of such horrific violence. Therefore, Canada fully supports the Arab Group resolution and is pleased by its prompt passage today. Canada also fully supports calls for Chapter 7 sanctions, designed to persuade the Syrian authorities to engage sincerely in the search for a peaceful, negotiated solution. Canada calls on all those that have sheltered the regime from international sanction to cease their efforts immediately and to join international efforts to pressure the Assad regime to end the violence and use their influence with Syria to bring about a peaceful political transition. We also learned yesterday of Special Envoy Kofi Annan's resignation. Canada is grateful for Mr. Annan's tireless efforts to end the bloodshed in Syria and achieve an inclusive, Syrian-led political transition. Sadly, with his departure, Mr. Annan's six-point plan is in practical terms dead, we continue to call on all parties to end the violence and to respect the basic rights of all Syrians. Thank you, Mr. President.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany.
Mr. President, Germany aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union. I would like to thank the Secretary General for his remarks. It is with great regret that we have learned of the Joint Special Envoy's resignation. We are grateful to him for the excellent work he has done in order to find a diplomatic solution to this conflict. His decision comes at a critical juncture. We understand and share the frustration that the six-point plan conceived by him and endorsed by the Security Council was not implemented due to the intransigence of the Syrian government, which has consistently failed to implement its obligations under Resolutions 2042 and 2043. Mr. President, we would also like to thank the chair of the Arab Group, the Ambassador of Saudi Arabia, for presenting today's resolution, which we fully endorse. It comes at a moment when the Security Council, due to 3 double vetoes, has not been able to live up to its responsibility and agree on measures to ensure compliance with its own decisions. This resolution, which received the overwhelming support of the membership, sends 2 clear messages. A message of support to the Syrian people in their suffering and struggle and their hope for a free and peaceful future. And a message to the Syrian regime that the international community does not and will not accept the war Assad wages against his own population. We condemn the threat by the regime to use chemical weapons in breach of international law and morality. We make an earnest call on all relevant forces in Syria to secure these weapons and to absolutely refrain from their use or transfer to others. Germany is deeply worried about the reports of ongoing severe human rights violations in Syria, especially against women and children. Accountability of those who violate and abuse human rights must be ensured. All parties to the conflict must ensure safe and unhindered access for providers of humanitarian assistance. Germany commends the governments and the people of Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon and Iraq for their support to the more than 120,000 refugees. That is why we have increased our humanitarian aid to 11.5 million euros. The situation in Syria has reached a turning point. It is now urgent to work towards a political transition that will silence the weapons and will give Syrians the opportunity to determine their own future. The blueprint for this transition is contained in the Annan Plan and the Geneva Communiqué. Such a transition has a chance to succeed only if Assad steps aside, opening the way for an interim government. And in this context, it is also of utmost importance that the opposition follows through on the decisions of the 3rd July Cairo meeting and finds a unified voice. Mr. President, there is not the shadow of a doubt. One day there will be a new Syria. Whether this day will be tomorrow or in weeks or months, it will come. Together with the Syrian people, we should work for a democratic Syria with religious freedom and where the rights of minorities are respected. Thank you, Mr. President.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Libya.
In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Thank you, Mr. President. In response to an initiative by the Arab Group, the General Assembly today adopted a resolution that aims at finding a solution of the tragic situation in Syria. It is a resolution that might repair the damage caused to the credibility of the United Nations because of the inability of the Security Council to fulfill its responsibilities vis-à-vis the massacres being suffered by the Syrian people at the hand of its government. Despite the fact that the resolution does not rise to the level of measures adopted by the Arab League in order to expedite a resolution of the crisis, but the outcome of voting showed a widespread support for the resolution, and it also sends a clear message to the Syrian regime that it cannot continue indefinitely in defying the international community and to continue its crimes against humanity and its grave violations of human rights in all Syrian cities. Yes, indeed, this is the last opportunity for the Syrian regime to recover its sanity and to recognize that it cannot continue to rule Syria on the dead bodies of innocent people who are demanding their legitimate rights. And I mean those ordinary people who have outpoured into the streets in hundreds of thousands, demanding peaceful transfer of power in a democratic fashion. The international community cannot coexist with a landscape of destruction left by tanks and airplanes that are bombing civilian population centers and killing scores of people every day without discrimination. No one cannot accept the constant stream of displaced of hundreds of thousands of people in Syria and forcing them to seek sanctuary outside the Syrian territory. Also, no one can accept a perpetuation of more flagrant violations of human rights. Unfortunately, we have learned from history that despots cannot cease to kill and to torture innocent people because tyrants always believe that they are always the more powerful and they cannot be vanquished. And they become seized of this mindset until they are eventually crushed by the people and end in a very tragic way. And this will be the inevitable destiny of Bashar al-Assad. Mr. President, the Syrian people has been forced to carry arms in self-defense in the face of a brutal attack by the army of the regime, its security forces, and pro-government militias. The Syrian people had no option. And here, in this moment, I would like to salute the Syrian people for its courage and its sense of resolve to achieve victory over its torturers and to attain its rights despite the inequality of power. Undoubtedly, the Syrian people will attain its legitimate demands and will eventually emerge victorious, exactly like the Libyan people, which emerged victorious against a similar tyrant. We deeply regret that some countries continue to masquerade behind the principle of sovereignty and the pretext of fear from extremism in order to provide assistance, military and political assistance to the Syrian regime, and therefore it becomes an accomplice in the crimes perpetrated by the regime. And we hope that these states would recognize that this is morally inadmissible and contravenes their interests in the long run. The General Assembly has moved and adopted today a resolution that calls upon the Syrian regime to take concrete and specific steps. But we doubt that the Syrian regime would respond to this resolution given its past record and behavior. And therefore, the General Assembly should not be just satisfied with this resolution only, but must follow up on its implementation. And in the case the Syrian regime did not respond favorably in a couple of weeks or 3, and the failure of the Security Council to fulfill its duties, let me repeat, and the failure by the Security Council to fulfill its mandate, then it becomes imperative upon the General Assembly to impose certain concrete sanctions against the Syrian regime including referring those responsible for certain crimes to the International Criminal Court and the suspension of the membership of the regime in international organizations. I thank you, sir.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Qatar.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, sir. Mr. President, the crisis in Syria have now passed the 500-day mark. With every slow passing day of those 500 days, the Syrian people sacrificed their blood, lost some of their finest youth, endured degrading treatment and the violation of their honor, suffered through scarcity of food, even bread, and severe shortage of electricity and fuel for heating and cooking, witnessed the deterioration of their economy and the devaluation of their currency, and saw their country on the brink of civil war. What is particularly pitiful is that these calamities have not been brought about by a major natural disaster, nor by a massive foreign army invasion, but have all been the result of a government opting for a policy that refuses reform, seeks to subject the people by force, and fails to uphold its responsibility for their protection. This style of governance does not belong among civilized nations, nor does this exclusionary authoritarian attitude belong in the 21st century. Now, if we followed the logic of the Syrian regime, we would put the blame on those demanding freedom, justice, and a dignified life for what has befallen their country. However, humanity rejects this logic, and history rejects these fallacies which we have been bombarded with, and which claim that the cause of this crisis is armed terrorist gangs and a universal conspiracy against Syria. The fact is that the adherents of these fallacies have not explained to us the millions of Syrian demonstrators who have taken to the streets day after day in thousands of protest flashpoints, putting their lives on the line. Are the Syrian people terrorists? Have those demonstrators put their lives on the line for a few dollars? Is yearning for freedom and insisting on human dignity considered terrorism now? Those who have echoed these fallacies have not explained to us why pro-freedom demonstrators have been killed and wounded, while not a single bullet has been fired on the rallies that the regime has organized in its support. They have not explained to us the visible devastation that has befallen Syrian cities, which can only be caused by merciless bombardment with thousands of tons of explosives, and it is known to all which party has them. They have not explained to us the daily scenes of citizens being insulted and humiliated by members of an army whose basic mission is to protect them. Neither have they explained to us why foreign journalists have been denied free access so they can impartially and transparently document the events. Moreover, they have not explained to us the reason behind cutting off communications, electricity, water, and main food supplies in the areas witnessing protests. Are armed terrorist gangs the ones who can cut off the internet and land and cellular telecommunications networks? Assuming all the accounts of the Syrian regime were true, why would the authorities and decision-makers in Damascus insist on using the full arsenal of the Syrian army against Syrian cities, towns and villages for more than 500 days, and pushing the country towards a sectarian war unless the blood of the heroic Syrian people is not dear to them? The world is tired of the continuous repeated lies that insult our intelligence. Those who make up and spread fictional stories about events in Syria should remember that they can fool some people sometime, but cannot fool all people all the time. They have to remember that they are not on the right side of history. Mr. President, in the face of all that is happening in Syria, the Security Council is unable to even uphold its responsibilities under the Charter of the United Nations to address the Syrian crisis, and the international community is unable to offer the Syrian people anything more than statements and condemnations. Every day we spend discussing formalities and theatrical principles. Violence claims the lives of hundreds of innocent people in Syria. Is not saving people, protecting their fundamental rights and dignity, and establishing justice and prosperity for them among the first and most important principles for which this organization has been established. Dwelling on debate about formalities played a role in the international community's slow response to tragedies such as the massacres in Rwanda, which we have pledged not to repeat. Faced with this situation, the General Assembly bears a moral responsibility to address this crisis, especially following the despair of the Joint Special Envoy of any positive response by the Syrian regime to diplomacy, and his request that the Security Council ensure the Syrian government's compliance with its obligations. Therefore, the draft resolution submitted by the Arab group comes as a necessary step and one that cannot be further delayed, especially in light of the escalation in violence by the Syrian regime, which has threatened to use weapons of mass destruction and threatened to ignite the region, and also in light of the worsening humanitarian situation and the flow of refugees to neighboring countries. The resolution reflects the positions of the international community, which call for a peaceful solution to the crisis based on a Syrian-led political transition process that meets the aspirations of the Syrian people and ensures accountability for those who killed them and violated their rights, freedoms and dignity, and that leads to the establishment of a pluralistic, democratic civil state with equal rights and freedoms. All this has to be in a way that preserves Syria's national and territorial unity, sovereignty and stability. Mr. President, it is ironic that the representative of Syria continues to devote his statements to haphazard accusations against other countries and to unrealistic justification of what is happening in Syria. This is but a desperate attempt to distract attention from the reality of what is happening and to put the blame on the others. And this is not surprising from the regime. Thank you, sir.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. يبدو أن
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation seems to be a victim of a conspiracy when we try to take the floor, but I'd like to just thank you and express my appreciation for giving me the floor now. I have taken the floor on behalf of the Arab group, the co-sponsors of this resolution, in order to address my sincere thanks to all states who voted in favor of this resolution and who sent thus a very strong message, most of all to the people of Syria. The Assembly is saying that their struggle is not far from our eyes, and that the international community is united with the people of Syria. The second message is pursuing a policy of using weapons is one that will not bear fruits, and to consider people as a minefield does not make the regime legitimate, and that killings cannot be a way to maintain the regime. The competence of the president cannot be based on a national consensus, a feeling of satisfaction or acceptance of this authority in this case. And these things cannot last. The third message has to do with a message to the Security Council and to the forces that undermine the adoption of a Council resolution, to say that the international community, with an overwhelming majority, is against positions taken or requests to take new positions, and would like the Security Council to be up to the task and up to its competence, and to deal with this question in a serious way. And the final message has to do with a message sent to the new JSE to say that the working framework of the envoy must be specific. Thank you once again, Mr. President, and thanks again to all states who supported this resolution. I think that these are states that really wanted to send a message of conscience and of history. Thank you.
Statement after the adoption of the resolution. Several representatives have requested to exercise the right of reply. May I remind members that statements on the exercise of the right of reply are limited to 10 minutes for the first intervention and to 5 minutes for the second intervention, and should be made by delegations from their seats. I call on the representative of Islamic Republic of Iran.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor. Mr. President, the representative of the Zionist criminal regime once again used this assembly and in deviation to the topic on the agenda, leveled some baseless allegations against my country. I do not want to tax the patience of this august body to reply at this late hour to, in detail, those nonsense allegations. However, I suffice myself to say that this regime has been and remains to be the only destabilizing entity in the Middle East that embarks on violence and all barbaric acts for its short-sighted and narrow-minded political aims. In the present crisis in Syria, Israeli agents, you can hear them talking in Hebrew, are actively engaged in arming and providing logistics to the terrorist groups to carry out their deadly operations against the innocent Syrian civilians and government institutions. This regime's history is full of acts of aggressions, violations of international law, state terrorism and assassinations. The assassination of Iran's nuclear scientists and cyber sabotage perpetuated by this regime are just some examples. A regime whose only source of pride is the occupation of others' territories, demolition of houses, killing of innocent children and defenseless women in the most barbaric way, and committing all types of atrocities, is not in a position to talk about others, let alone to pass judgments on others. Thank you very much.
I call on the representative of Bahrain.
Thank you, Mr. President. Sir, in response to a remark made by the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic, I wish to explain the following. The forces present in the Kingdom of Bahrain are the joint forces of Al Jazeera, the Peninsula Shield Forces of the Gulf Cooperation Council of the Arab States of the Gulf, on the basis of an agreement concluded among members of the Council in 2000. These forces are deployed to deter any external threat. I thank you, Mr. President.
I call on the representative of Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is indeed regrettable that we have listened to a cascade of mischaracterizations and falsehoods ingrained in the statements of many statements. In the statement of the European Union, we have heard remarks to the effect that they care about the welfare of the Syrian people. Let me ask here, would the sanctions imposed by the European Union against the Syrian people falls within this scope? Would impeding access to the basic and essential needs for the living and well-being of the Syrian people falls within this scope? Would imposing sanctions against members of the Syrian government only after a few days of their appointments to their positions is an attempt to advance dialogue, especially the sanctions imposed against the Minister of National Reconciliation? Mr. President, in the statement by the representative of Libya, we have heard many falsehoods and many accusations without any base. And it is indeed regrettable that the representative of Libya would speak about my country in an irresponsible way. Let me remind the Libyan delegate that my country did not call for outside military intervention in our country. We cannot remain or be followers of others. Let me quote here what Mr. Mustafa Abdul-Jalil said in an interview during the cultural Ramadan event. He said, Qatar supports Islamic trends and it has an interest in establishing a system of government that is anchored in Islamic Sharia. No one went to Qatar without receiving a sum of money received from the government of Qatar. This is sufficient for me in that regard. Also, in response to the delegate from Qatar, we have been surprised by the language he used, as if we were listening to the TV channel that is broadcasting from his country, as if we were listening to a statement read in this afternoon plenary meeting that followed the same approach. I wonder here if the delegate of Qatar would explain to us the reason for financing the terrorist groups, let him explain to us who is responsible for acts of violence and terrorism that are being undertaken in Syria. Could he explain to us why Qatar has been keen when to discourage the opposition from dialogue and to resort to violence, as the Emir of Qatar himself did? Could he explain why his country impedes the implementation of the six-point plan of Mr. Kofi Annan, and to judge it only after 2 days of its adoption, that it stands 2% chance of success? Mr. President, Syria, in the protocol of 1925 that prohibits the asphyxiation gas, and it is committed to that protocol and is willing to accede to the Convention on the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons in case Israel acceded to that convention. Syria acceded to non-proliferation treaty according to the resolution of 1995 regarding the extension of NPT, which was re-emphasized by the Review Conference of 2010. Syria has always calling for establishing a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. In 2003, when Syria was a member of the Security Council, submitted a resolution on behalf of the Arab group in order to establish a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. But countries that express concern over the alleged presence of these weapons are the same countries that obstructed that resolution and threatened to use the veto only to protect their protege Israel, and submitted nuclear submarines to Israel. And nonetheless, Syria continued to maintain that draft resolution, and it is regrettable that we see double standard. If Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the Secretariat of the League of Arab States were serious in their efforts, they should have emphasized the dangers of the Israeli nuclear threat rather than opening new fronts in the Islamic world. But the representatives of Saudi Arabia and Qatar have been misleading when they referred to chemical weapons alleged to be present in Syria, while they should have expressed concern towards the arsenal of chemical and the nuclear arsenal in Israel, which occupies Arab lands. I thank you, Mr. President.
The General Assembly has thus concluded this stage of its consideration of Agenda Item 34. The meeting is adjourned.